My name is Callista Barrett. I'm an anthropologist at the Kimberley Land Council. I'm just here to introduce the next speaker. I'll first echo what has already been said and acknowledge the country that we're on and the traditional owners and pay my respects to them and their elders. And I'm here to introduce, it's already up, Petronella Vaarzon-Morel. She asked me not to go through her extensive and illustrious career and just briefly say that she is currently a co-director of the Centre for Native Title Anthropology. She's worked in Central Australia as an anthropologist for over 40 years, primarily in Central Australia. And since 2013, she has been engaged as a sessional lecturer in anthropology at New York University in Sydney. And I'm looking forward to her presentation on the Western Desert. I've only worked on the fringes of the Western Desert myself in the Kimberley, so I'm looking forward to learning a lot from this presentation. Welcome, Petronella.
Okay. Oh, okay, thanks. Okay, thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I speak today, and elders past and present. Thank you. So, in keeping with the theme of the workshop, that anthropologists and lawyers often use the same terms but differently, I was invited to address anthropological and ethnographic understandings of the concept of the cultural bloc and its treatment in native title jurisprudence. Now, I'm an anthropologist and not a lawyer, and so I won't presume to speak of any specialist meanings that may be in the wider legal field. But in the context of native title claims, the phrase cultural bloc has been used by anthropologists to model a particular society to which the claimant group belongs. So, in my presentation today, I'll begin by addressing the requirement in native title law to identify the nature of the society. I'll then provide some background on the anthropological concept of cultural bloc and its use in discussions of Aboriginal Australia. I'll then turn to the application of the concept in native title claims, in particular those concerned with claims to the Western Desert, and I'll look at a couple of case studies, to Rose Hill and the Ulara native title compensation claim. Okay, so in doing so, I'll try to highlight some areas of contestation and different views on the utility of the concept. So before discussing the anthropological concept of cultural bloc, it's necessary to address the requirement in native title law to identify the nature of society. Now, in his presentation to the Native Title Forum in January this year in Brisbane, Dr. David Martin, sitting over here, observed that while anthropologists have things to say about the nation of society, it is, quote, not directly the society of native title jurisprudence. He cautioned furthermore that as anthropologists, we need to be very careful that we don't buy into the notion of society as it has been interpreted in law, because it can be very different in anthropology. While the term society is not used in the Native Title Act, in the context of native title, society has a legal meaning derived from the native title jurisprudence rather than anthropology. Anthropologist Dr. Kingsley Palmer has provided a really useful summary of the society issue in his book, Australian Native Title Anthropology, and I'll draw on it in this section today. So the High Court's decision in Yorta Yorta saw the introduction of the notion of society in native title law, and that decision sets out the relationship between the continuity of laws and customs, the normative system, the rights to land and water and the society, and how we should understand that society. And here are some relevant passages from the judgment. Some of you may be very familiar with it and others not so. So I'll just read part of it. To speak of rights and interests possessed under an identified body of laws and customs is therefore to speak of rights and interests that are creatures of the laws and customs of a particular society that exists as a group which acknowledges and observes those laws and customs. And it goes on to say that if the society no longer exists, then, those laws and customs cease to have continued existence and vitality. Sorry, this one here. Another passage, it will be necessary to inquire about the relationship between the laws and customs now acknowledged and observed and those that were acknowledged and observed before sovereignty, and to do so by considering whether laws and customs can be said to be laws and customs of the societies whose laws and customs are properly described as traditional laws and customs. Okay. And so this is a really relevant passage in terms of how they want us to think about society in the native title context. Law and custom arise out of, and in important respects, go to define a particular society. In this context, society is to be understood as a body of persons united in and by its acknowledgement and observance of a body of law and customs. So Kingsley Palmer has observed that the terms community and society are often used interchangeably, and we see that in the various discussions and the way the different native title cases that are put out. But basically, they share the same meaning of who share commonalities and adhere to the same system of laws and customs. In his overview of the question of society, Kingsley, in the context of native title, Kingsley argues that it's important for anthropologists to come to grips with the idea of society and to show that members belong to a single society and they share laws and customs. So regardless of the fact that anthropology has different methods and is an open field of inquiry, within the context of native title, we have to just focus it on what is required by that situation. Okay. So the courts have recognised that a native title society may encompass different groupings of people, the members of which may not share exactly the same cultural features. For example, they may be associated with different language dialects or different areas. And the Sampi versus Western Australia, the Bardi Jawi case, which a lot of you would be familiar with, is a good example of this. And in that case, the court found that the Jawi people had integrated into Bardi society over time through intermarriage and shared cultural practices. So that despite any kind of historical differences that they may have had, at that point they now formed a single unified society. So the case is considered important in terms of the need to focus on Indigenous social structures from a legal point of view. Okay. So the term society is not a term of art with a specialised meaning in anthropology. However, it's a useful concept to refer to groups of people who share similar cultural attributes, for example, practices, language and beliefs. Anthropological understandings have evolved since the beginning of the discipline. They haven't stayed static. And whereas earlier anthropological analysis may have imagined societies as a bounded, stable group, anthropology, and Tyndale's classic example, now emphasise social process and relationships that change over time. Kingsley Palmer contrasts anthropological methods of social inquiry and thinking about society with that of lawyers. He draws on Beattie, who observed that in anthropology, society is not a thing, but is comprised of a set of relationships. And he suggests that perhaps lawyers think of it as a thing. And he also draws attention to the fact that in a native title case, you're focusing on something at a particular point in time. Okay. So despite the very real differences between anthropological understandings of society and those of native title law, Kingsley argues that by adopting a particular model and focusing on structure, it's possible for anthropologists to work within their discipline, quote, while developing methodological discriminations that mediate between the fundamentals of social inquiry and the legal requirements for expert opinion and evidence. So, as anthropologists working in native title claims, we've got to go back, of course, to the earlier ethnography, and that requires us to look at what are the terms that are used to describe different social groupings, what are the assumptions behind those terms and the ideas as well. And so you've got earlier observers using terms like community, tribe, language groups, and sometimes nations for different regional social groupings. And then looking at this material, we need to think about the scale of what they're talking about as well. Is it a larger grouping? Is it a smaller one? Is it a larger grouping with subgroups and members of whom may not share all the same cultural traits? And in relation to the latter, at what point does that difference constitute considering different societies? So these are all kind of issues. Sutton has observed that the ethnographic literature refers to different kinds of Aboriginal groupings, but not all of these are defined in relation to land or territoriality. And in choosing how to model a community or society for native title purposes, Kingsley Palmer discusses 4 different models that can be used for heuristic purposes. So they're representations of society, okay? And the models he discusses are cultural bloc, tribe, language groups, and what he calls cultural cohesion. That is a model characterised by unifying characteristics such as ritual and economic links, close kinship, or a geographic feature such as a draining system. Now, he's not suggesting these are the only ones, and in fact, you might put forward a model that's a combination of things, but it's just looking at what is the utility of these. While each model may have shortcomings, he views each model as anthropologically viable for developing a notion of society that can both account for earlier ethnographies and present situation. But of course, the potential use of a model is going to depend on the data that you collect in the field and the research and that particular situation. So I'm going to forget about tribes and all those others and just focus on the central topic of this presentation, which is the cultural bloc, and how it's been used in Australian. I'll start with looking at how it's been used in Australian anthropology generally and in the context of native title claims. But first, I just want to consider briefly how it's used in everyday usage. So the term bloc, spelt without a K on the end, is said to have entered English language during the 20th century and is derived from the Old French word bloc with a K, meaning log or block of wood. According to the dictionary, the word block with a K entered Middle English about 400 years before block with a C. And the online etymology dictionary traces earlier roots for both words to the Old Dutch word block, meaning trunk of a tree. So while both terms have similar origins, block with a K generally, as we know, connotes a physical entity rather than an abstract one. The Oxford English Dictionary traces the first English adoption of the word to 1903, when it's used to refer to a political faction. It defines bloc as, quote, an alliance of states, political parties, people or groups formed to further a particular goal or interest. And it provides these different word associations, one of which is society, but you'll notice a lot of the others are to do with nation states. And synonyms provides there as well: alliance, faction, coalition, also grouping. So in everyday English, the term bloc is commonly used in the context of political, economic interests of entities associated with nation states. And you'd all be used to hearing words like Eastern Bloc, Trading Bloc, Soviet Bloc, Power Bloc, that kind of thing, right? So general anthropological usage. So in anthropology, it's not been confined to discussion of nation states, of course, because we don't only work with nation states. I canvassed the Human Relations Area Files, which is a fully indexed cultural database that covers world cultures and societies with a focus on the non-industrial, and to look at how cultural bloc is used in the term bloc by anthropologists. So the database found about over 1,000 paragraphs containing the term bloc and cultural bloc in about 400 documents across 159 regions, for example, Africa, Oceania, South America. But it breaks down those regions into different kinds of economies, including horticulturists, hunter-gatherers, and other subsistence combinations. And you won't be surprised to hear that the attributes of social cultural bloc in industrial economies are not the same as those in subsistence economies. So anthropological analysis that referred to hunter-gatherer and subsistence economies used the term bloc to refer to groupings or aggregations of people associated with socio-cultural features such as shared ritual, mythology, social relations, linguistic and territorial affiliations, exchange and trade relations. And it was also used to refer to areas over which groups have rights and control of resources. So, reflecting changing anthropological approaches, most sources in the last 30 years in the RAF files do not conceptualise cultural blocs in terms of bounded stable entities. They don't assume that constituents of cultural blocs share all the same cultural properties, nor in equal measures. And while accounts can speak of core groups sharing features, for example, mythology and ritual practice, they also refer to transitional features between neighbouring groups, and they acknowledge cultural influence, dispersion of cultural features, and references to centres of acculturation suggest the permeable or open nature of cultural blocs, despite being conceived of in spatial terms. So the point of this is really to indicate, this brief exercise, ways in which ideas and assumptions influence our understandings, but also how those that we may be working with, who are not anthropologists, the assumptions that they may bring to it. And in terms of Beattie's comment about society not being a thing or people treating it as a thing, and anthropologists not, I'd add to that people also think of it as a container. They think of it as a container, that everyone in it has to share the same properties and, you know, that they're equal. So there's kind of, and this comes from a kind of way of categorising the world in terms of a classical set theory, rather than thinking about there may be some exemplars that share the core attributes and bases, but others might not. Okay. So turning back to wider anthropological literature in Indigenous Australia, drawing on Sutton, Burnt and others, Palmer's traced the use of the concept of cultural bloc to sets of relations used to identify societies. And the concept of bloc I use here concerns aggregations of groups that are united by some common features. So we have, a lot of you would be familiar with R.F. Matthews, Roth, who talked about messmates, Howitt, etc., that provide evidence for regional aggregations based on cultural commonalities. R.H. Matthews in Eastern Australia used different types of initiation rituals as criteria for determining ritual blocks, and he illustrated these in a map. Both Professor Sutton and Nicholas Peterson have used drainage systems to identify regional groupings. Okay, I'm not suggesting these are sort of should be used for native title claims, but just looking at the way people have used regional groupings. Most people think of Radcliffe Brown as being only interested in local groups such as the Horde, but as Sutton points out, that in fact he was also interested in expansion and contraction of social solidarity, and that he commented that some Aboriginal systems showed wider social integration through kinship and ceremonial links through others, and that would apply to the Western Desert. Okay, so more than 50 years ago, R.M. Burnt turned his attention to social aggregations in what he called the Western Desert region. In his 1959 paper, The Concept of the Tribe in the Western Desert of Australia, he used the term cultural bloc in reference to the Western Desert region, and he was the first anthropologist to do so. His paper was concerned with consumptions behind the use of the tribe and its appropriateness for the Australian situation. And he said that the problem could be seen within the more inclusive question of how best to define a society. He referred to the Western Desert in terms of geographic area, and within the Western Desert region, he referred to smaller groups by dialect names. And he talks about, in that paper, Elkin as well, who referred to these named groups not as dialect groups, but as tribes of the Western group, and said that they were characterised by a number of cultural and social organisational features. Elkin was of the view that the tribal groups could refer to either a single or groups of hordes, and according to both Elkin and Berndt, they both agreed it was impossible to demarcate the groups using hard territorial boundaries. Now, despite noting that the groupings within Western Desert region had a bias towards patrilineal descent, Berndt regarded the landowning unit as the patrilineal descent group with spiritual and ritual ties. He notes that in contrast to Elkin, as we all know, Tyndale regarded tribal groups as having defined boundaries. But Berndt was in agreement largely with Elkin and concluded most groups are not tribes, there are no strict boundaries, he's talking about Western Desert, that movements are relatively frequent, and that what we are faced with is rather a cultural and a social bloc. He considered that the way that people selected names from the groups within a common range inferred the recognition of a common language as dialectical variation. So he's talking about a common awareness of people who belong to that cultural linguistic bloc, that they share commonalities and that they're recognised. For Berndt, a dialect was associated with a local group. He noted it wasn't a closed group insofar as speakers of other dialects could have married into it. And he also said it wasn't the widest social unit. And he said that you'd expect to find a number of these throughout the Western Desert and that they maintained linkages. So in considering the applicability of the term tribe, Berndt was concerned to identify the widest functional significant social unit in terms of the interactions of its members and their reciprocal duties and obligations. So he identified a number of social units, including the local group, the horde, religious cult, etc., and a more wider labile unit, which came together seasonally. And he concluded on the basis of his data that it was inappropriate to talk of the dialectical group as a tribe, and that moreover, the use of the term tribe was not entirely applicable to any social group found in the Western Desert. And contrasting that with, say, the Aranda situation in Central Australia, which has got a much more, but not totally defined, kind of well-delineated area. Okay. So in considering the applicability, for Berndt, the Western Desert Cultural Bloc comprised a number of societies. And I think this is a really important thing that some people who go to the Berndt article don't actually because it's quite a dense article, necessarily take this on. But he's calling dialectical groups societies. And it's really important to kind of recognise, as Kingsley Palmer points out, that the characteristics that Berndt attributes to a society do not clearly equate to a society in a native title law. And that the closest that we come to the way he considers society is having broadly common aims that members of the society may share. Thanks. To summarise then, for Berndt, the concept of cultural bloc involves sharing common culture. There's no necessity speech, face-to-face interaction or members of a dialect group using or occupying the whole cultural bloc. Features included shared myths and dreaming track relations between groups who are part of that bloc, sharing a common language and recognition of elements of a common culture. And Berndt actually, in a 1976 paper, used that concept of cultural bloc for a group in northeastern Arnhem Land. Okay. So turning to the De Rose Hill native title claim, in the top part of South Australia. It was the first Western Desert native title claim to be heard. So there'd been cases that looked at Western Desert land tenure under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory, but this is the first one to be litigated in native title. It was determined in 2002, but the decision was appealed, with a decision delivered in 2005 following the appeal. The case was heard by Justice O'Loughlin, a judge of the Federal Court. Significantly, so De Rose was the first litigated native title claim to use the concept of cultural bloc. And it was significant that in that claim, Justice O'Loughlin accepted that members of the Western Desert Cultural Bloc were members of a single society. And this is what he said about it. The normative system on which they relied was that of the Western Bloc, and that they acknowledged laws and customs, that it had continued to exist since sovereignty in an uninterrupted way. So Craig Elliott authored the anthropological report submitted on behalf of the claimants and was an expert witness. Justice O'Loughlin accepted his description of the geographic area of the Western Desert as being generally consistent with the ethnographers that had come before and the opinions of the expert witnesses who gave evidence in that court case. So in terms of its cultural attributes, he found that it was generally accepted within the Western Desert literature, language, laws, customs, religious, spiritual matters, and he looked at it in terms, he had to look at the burn, whatever, but that the way that the Western Desert concept was being used was generally consistent. And he identified Yankudjara, Pidginjara, Underkrinya, Ngadajara and Nganyajara as some of those dialect groups that were relevant. So when recently I asked Craig Elliott about his use of the term cultural bloc in De Rose Hill, he told me that he referred to the concept of social and cultural bloc only in the context of referencing Bernst's 1959 paper. And his purpose in doing so was to draw attention to Bernst's statement that the Western Desert Bloc was a socio-linguistic unit and not a landholding entity. So the model that was put forward in De Rose Hill was one of multiple pathways. Importantly, the judge accepted the criteria put forward by which a person could be both a Ngururija for the land and have a connection to the land through traditional laws and customs. And these are the different pathways. And the last one, of course, is being very important. To these must be added the additional requirement that the claimant is recognised as Ngururija or traditional owner for the claim areas by the other Ngururija. Craig referred to the Eastern Western Desert to model the relevant community to which the claimants belong, and he proposed 10 indicators as a way of defining that society. And he treated it as a community of people within the broader Western Desert. He came in for heavy criticism of that within the judgment, and particularly by Professor Maddock, who criticised him on the basis that the 10 indicators that he proposed couldn't really distinguish those people out of the rest of the Western Desert, and that nowhere in the literature had anthropologists previously noted and named the Eastern Western Desert in that way. But in the final submissions, the applicants did not rely on the Eastern Desert model, and Justice O'Loughlin accepted that anthropologists had considered the station to be part of the Western Desert Bloc, and although earlier ethnographers had identified it as Underkrinya territory. And he said, there's no reason why it shouldn't be accepted that the occupants at sovereignty followed the same traditional laws and customs of those of the claimants. Interestingly, he also said there was no reason why the migratory movements of Pidginjara to the east, whether as a result of drought or war or marriage, should not be accepted as part of the history and social structure of the Aboriginal people of the Western Desert Bloc. So I think these are really kind of important systems about acknowledging the normative system of the Western Desert. However, in the end, the judge found that, quote, the claimants had failed to prove they'd maintained a connection to the area by the traditional laws and customs acknowledged and observed by them. A subsequent appeal, and basically Maddock had run the argument, and Justice O'Loughlin basically accepted it that they hadn't frequented the area for a very long time, and it turned out, in fact, they were being kept out by the owner of the station and not allowed access to it. The case went to appeal, and Justice O'Loughlin was heavily criticised for all the reasons that he didn't recommend the claim. And so ultimately the claim was successful. The full court recognised that the applicants formed a small group within the much larger Western Desert Cultural Bloc who share the same laws and customs, the normative system, and that it had found to be uninterrupted since the time of sovereignty. So very quickly, just finishing on the Yulara native title compensation case. So Professor Sutton was the major anthropologist involved in this. I also worked on the claim and gave evidence and wrote a report concerning changes to do with birthing practices and what that would mean in terms of the land tenure model. So the Yulara decision came down after De Rose Hill, was in 2006, and the claimants in the Yulara native title compensation case asserted that they and their ancestors held native title rights and customs to the Yulara area under the laws and customs of the Western Desert Cultural Bloc. They claimed descent from people of the Western Desert at sovereignty and asserted they had similar laws and customs held by the people, and we use the term of the Eastern Western Desert, subject to adaptive change. Similar to De Rose Hill, the case relied on multiple pathways model, although initially more criteria were used. Over the course of the claim, these were narrowed down, and but overall, the multiple pathways model was very similar to that used in De Rose Hill. In Yulara, however, the judge hearing the case, Justice Sackville, rejected the model, and he relied very heavily on early ethnography, particularly that of Norman Tyndale, which asserted a patrilineal model of landholding for estate groups within the Western Desert. He didn't accept that the Western Desert, the multiple pathways model, meant that there was a degree of negotiation and possibility of contestation. In fact, in his understanding, he said that if this was the case, then changes since sovereignty could not be structurally modelled and would could not amount to adaptive change. He accepted that the evidence supported the views of a Western Desert society, and he used the term the Western Desert Bloc. But the key point here is he relied on early ethnographic evidence about small groups consisting of people recruited by patrilineal descent. Now, I don't know if you've read it, but there's a wonderful article by Laurent Doucet and Katie Glasgow on how models become myths. And in that article, they observe how what happened in the Yulara case, in fact, while there were many other complex issues, but here I'm just focused on the issue of the cultural bloc and the models, that the claimants were actually measured, their social and local organisation measured against what turns out to be a rather mythic kind of situation. And they said the irony is that the judge and respondents reconstructed a traditional culture that has never existed, comparing this culture with contemporary people's ways of thought and practice and ways of objectifying their cultural models. So with that, I think my time is up. Yeah, so thanks very much. Yeah.
So we just heard papers from Jitendra and Richard before you, which were focused on so-called descent models in cases of so-called succession, which it seems to me actually showed that so-called descent models allow for all sorts of multiple pathways in the real world. And the courts refused to accept, in the Ilara case, an explicit multiple pathway model which provides for the day-to-day politics involved in negotiating the real world. To what extent do you accept these models as categorically different, or would you say they're variations on a similar theme?
Well, I would say that the patrilineal model is variation on a theme, but a very narrow model because it's not recognising the descent from cognatic descent from both parties or the importance of birthing. And, you know, one of the factors, and plus other factors, is that multiple pathway, right? I think an irony of the present situation is that with a lot of people no longer living on the lands necessarily, many of them are kind of falling back to following the country of their father or their mother or both, because most people are no longer being born out on the land, right? So, yeah. Thank you. Trinity?
I'll ask something if...
I was just going to say, yeah, I'd just like to hear from you about your kind of experiences with...
Oh, Trinity, yeah.
I don't know that I've got a question, but given you've invited me to talk, I'll try and say something. Riffing on what you just asked, Kevin, it sort of strikes me that part of the models that sort of exist in the desert are oriented towards flexibility, and that I guess in the context of succession, there's almost this other hidden rule, which is that the dreaming
Absolutely.
Must continue, and then so whatever change comes to succeed what was before is again oriented towards succession and to flexibility, and so I can kind of see a connection there with the sorts of models that are presented in the desert. I guess just as a bit of a comment on some of the yet to be determined areas in certainly the goldfields, and I hear sort of into some of Central Desert's region, is that there's change, but not change by everyone that's making claims for native title.
Yeah.
And that some of the disputes very much go to, it's probably not an absolutely true dichotomy, but those with ritual knowledge and have continued to access areas, and those that may or say that they have ancestral ties to that country, sometimes relying on the maps of the likes of Tyndale, which adds like a real complexity, I think, in the absence of contemporary claimants having much to say about the areas that they're claiming native title to. There's a huge reliance, I think, on anthropologists to sort of fill the gap, and also lawyers. It's not just anthros, it's lawyers too, to sort of execute a claim, but you've kind of got not a lot of information to deal with. And part of the result of that is a lot of intramural disputes, which end up, in the native title context, end up kind of being presented as, on one side you have, no, there are multiple pathways and it is really flexible, and a rejection almost of some of the pathways. And I'm reminded of Lee Sackett's 2013 paper that sort of proposes that there was descent and then there was flexibility, and there seems to be an orienting back towards descent. And I suppose my added comment to that is sort of a yes, but not by everyone.
I see that I've been working with David Martin in the Illawarra area on a ILSC project, but we've seen similar things happening down there as well. And often you get people with incredible knowledge, etc., but the people whose perhaps fathers were born there and lived there have never been to the area or whatever. So yeah, a lot of differences like that. Yeah. Thank you.
Beaten by the clap. Just a quick comment on Kevin's comment, which I think is really important. I think it might have been Keane, but someone can correct me, who talked about if you look across Australia, it was one giant system. It was a system where we use the term descent, but underneath that, it's actually spiritual imbuement that links you to that country and therefore to the people on the country. It's manifested in different ways, in different places, but it's something I think we can usefully factor into our anthropology. Just to give one example, in the people with whom I'm most familiar, the term for what they call story equals dreaming translates as the ancestral, ritually dangerous father's father, in other words, the grandfather. And that maps onto quite similar beliefs 2,000 kilometres further west with 11 tribes that were written about of having not the father's father, but the father's brother as the term for it. So when we're talking about descent, I think we need to look at the underlying principles. It is my understanding, I stand to be corrected, that not a single group across Australia had our version of biological conception of the child. It was always ritual. Ritual means the stirring of in the womb in a certain area meant that spirit had entered, whatever it was. Wicca, again, were the closest. They have the actual father, what we would call the biological father, it translates very close to the father who begets you, but there's a number of others who are father. If we focus on the spiritual side of it and see this as one system, then what you have is adaptations of this religious system, again, burnt-called clans, religious corporations. It's not a people linked by genetics, it's people linked by spiritual imbuement of your essence as a being in that area. So I think we can see transitions and alterations in that light usefully.
I'd agree with that. I would add something to it, though, that you have to be, as anthropologists, we need to also be careful of how it is that the claimants themselves are phrasing things. And in the Tea Tree land claim, under NT Aboriginal Land Rights Act, this became an issue. And in fact, the authors of the land claim report put forward that it was spiritual descent. And this was heavily criticised by the anthropologist John Avery. And one of the things, and he provided a report to the judge that was hearing the claim. And of course, what he did was also go through the transcript and looked at the way that the claimants had phrased their relationship to how they held the country. And majority of them didn't speak in terms of spiritual descent, even though we all know, and I've worked with those people. And so the way that the court process redefines things, you have to be very careful. We know in writing the report and in also the questions that lawyers need to ask, right? Need to kind of take into account these factors.
Okay, and now we have reached time, and Julie gave me the power of the bell. So let's thank Petronella again, and then there's afternoon tea, I think.